Estamos llegando ya al final.
Well, we're getting into the final round of discussions. We're exploring this issue with Ancor and with Federico, interacting with people from the Treasury Department at the U.S. Treasury Department. We also looked at discussions with India, and this generated a lot of interest in becoming more familiar with. It's not really a new. Uh, it's not something new, but it can take on a lot of relevance in the region. And as we've been discussing since Tuesday, the region has seen a serious deterioration in terms of its fiscal position from 40% of GDP to more than 80% of GDP projected by the end of 2021, according to IMF projections. This has been the result, as was pointed out by Eduardo Engel, that the countries had, of course, space to address the situation that COVID-19 has presented. But in addition, this has had a significant short-term impact. We know, based on various studies undertaken in the IDB, throughout the region is faced with a major bias in introducing serious maintenance cuts, serious maintenance cuts in terms of the fiscal consolidation. And this is the result of the lack of flexibility that Gerardo talked about in the contingent liabilities discussion earlier. What we're doing now is what we're losing capital as a region. At the same time, we are incurring larger logistical costs and other expenditures. I know Professor Bonifato presentation has talked about an increase of traffic accidents as a result of a drop in maintenance of roads. And as was already indicated, this will unleash, and I don't think this year is going to be much different from last year. Hopefully, we'll return to a new normal, but this is going to leave our governments with very little wiggle room, and we're going to have to resort to innovation and creativity to do more with less. And this is the idea, the diagnostic that when we talked about the recycling of assets, we are drawing on experiences in throughout the world. In the region, there's been some sporadic attempts, some things that have been done by Monadin and the Chile Infrastructure Fund, although yesterday we see that it's taking on another role. So I just wanted to offer the floor to Federico so that he can discuss in some detail some of his conclusions based on experiences and what do we need to look at in terms of the right conditions to apply these and replicate them in our own region. Well, thank you, Gaston. It is a pleasure to be here, to be able to share with the audience a topic that, as Gaston aptly stated, can become a crucial tool in the context of our region's development over the next few years, starting off with the fact that, and I would like to start off here, what is asset recycling not? What is it not? I think this applies to most of the PPPs. The first is it's not a fast track for developing projects. It is not a way to leapfrog and jump over, bypass the infrastructure and project planning or prior planning. And it is not the model that we're looking at because we don't have resources. That would be the wrong motive to implement something like this. And then the third point, that it's not a model that we have to apply for the payment of public debt to monetize assets and to service the public debt. So those are the things we need to make clear on the table. In other words, what is the purpose? What is it not? What is asset recycling not in terms of its usefulness as a providing tools for the infrastructure project? So this is something I took the liberty to include, and I know that this applies to practically all of Latin America. And this is the focus that we have had historically in the construction phase, more specifically, the launching of infrastructure projects. Now, having said that, you see some, for example, articles in the press looking at the costs of highways, and it's always framed as just the construction costs. I think the maintenance cost seems to be somewhat neglected. So we start off on that basis. And I just want to say with this, we're starting off with the fact that we're seeing changes in the paradigms that underlie these kinds of models. So the first question that we need to ask is that, are we building things, quote unquote? I think in this discussion, that's one of the key changes that we need to propose. Are we building things, quote unquote, that are then discarded or neglected, or are we developing public services, quality public services? That's another way of looking at infrastructure development. And having said that, then we look at two key premises. First of all, we talk about infrastructure projects that need to be they need to
electorales,
they
políticos.
need to be they need to have that continuity from one government administration to another. And then number two, infrastructures that are discussed from the perspective of a system. This is not one isolated road or an airport or power lines that are just isolated or grids. They're the part of an infrastructure, a comprehensive infrastructure based on a long-term perspective. So these are some of the questions that come to mind or we need to pose so that we can establish a checklist to follow up the infrastructure development and how can we optimize the recycling of assets. So the first consideration, I think I already mentioned, but I think it needs to be repeated. The project that we develop, is it aligned with our long-term strategies? That's the first consideration. And I think we'll be surprised to learn that it's not always the case. Is it focused on providing service as opposed to just building a public work project? What about the funding scheme or mechanism, looking at the resources that the government has available? Are we looking at it from that perspective, or are we implementing this in an isolated, something that's completely withdrawn and isolated from the reality? Are we maintaining, programming the maintenance and operations functions? I think we need to highlight that, and I said this, I say it in jest, but it is a reality. We economists always say that all infrastructure generates development, and we know that that's not necessarily the case. Infrastructure that is not aligned with a country's long-term strategies, they are, or for example, those that go beyond established timelines and have significant cost overruns, those are not consistent with a long-term strategy. It becomes a burden both on the economy and fiscally as well. So these elements lead to the following. Is it possible to monetize the existing infrastructure? Are we able to generate new investments as we've looked at in each case? So here's an example that Gaston mentioned related to Australia. Australia has created a program focused, a significant program to recycle assets. In fact, the flagship of the global efforts. I can also refer to the case of India with some recent experiences in terms of monetizing assets. But in the case of Australia, it's surprising to see how they've been able to develop a program, a sustainable one that allows them to monetize about $30 million in infrastructure projects. So here we begin to ask ourselves several questions. One that comes to mind frequently in Latin America is, what about charging for assets that we thought were free? So these are two things that need to be considered. When we have free infrastructure, these are infrastructure that somebody else is paying for. And number two, looking at in the medium and long term, we know that several of the repayment funds of infrastructure projects, together with those that governments have had historically, tend to erode over time. One example would be the fuel taxes. In many countries in Latin America, we depend on the gasoline, fossil fuels taxes for supporting road construction and road projects. And in this regard, we're seeing a transition toward the use of clean fuels. So how are we going to pay for future infrastructure costs? Now, Australia has begun to take steps, for example, the pay-as-you-go or pay for the use per kilometer. And they're looking at exactly what that transition will be in accordance with what's coming up over the next few years.
What is asset recycling? And what do we mean by monetizing an infrastructure project? First, and this could sound a bit repetitious, we think it's interesting because, as evident as it may seem, it's often what we leave aside in project development in our region. Projects start by preparatory phases, the initial stages of preparation, planning, structuring, all that it takes to turn that idea into a project, in order to then move on to implementation and to the subsequent operation and maintenance of the project as such. That said, this is the ideal life cycle, but what has happened traditionally? Traditionally, we remain in the implementation phase, and this was illustrated by the initial articles. Normally, the road, the port, or what have you, costs so much, but no reference is made, or very little, to the previous path and what follows as well. So what does this lead us to? Well, we start with projects that are inaugurated and they start to suffer deterioration over time. There are several estimates, some of them by the IDB, and there's another one that I like to bring up by the Materials and Structural Models Lab in Colombia for roads. And there are similar indicators in other countries, by the way, and they estimated that each dollar you don't spend on maintenance today translates into 7 to 8 future dollars in rebuilding infrastructure assets. So here we are putting on the table what we have today, which is infrastructure development focusing only on implementation phases and infrastructure that what we end up doing is leaving up to future generations the repayment and rebuilding. So at the end of the day, we may see more investment in the future in reconstruction, but it's investment that wouldn't have really been necessary and that could have gone into other sectors. So how does all this help, and how has it helped countries that have implemented the asset recycling model for the purposes of developing infrastructure? This is how it works. By way of example, the International Monetary Fund, and this is an analysis dating back to 2018, including the estimated value of the infrastructure stock for 30 countries, the average being 65% of GDP. That was the value of infrastructure. Looking at all projects that, well, not all of the projects that could have been eligible for recycling, not all sectors are included, but there are clearly identified possibilities for countries to utilize assets that are not currently in the equation. We talk about the liabilities, but we don't talk about the assets that we have and that could be capitalized on significantly. So the asset recycling model is about taking an already existing project, giving it to the private sector for exploitation, and the private party pays to the government, to the administration, funds that may be reinvested in other projects. So this is the graphic presentation. So we move away from this kind of system that leads to deterioration that will end up being more costly in the end. And we move towards this model in which the government has built and now offers a PPP with the private party being willing to pay to the government for the right to exploit. So this way, you cover the operation and maintenance needs, which would otherwise not have been there. And at the same time, we generate funds for projects, especially in areas around the project at hand, because we know this is a culture that will gradually adapt to payment for infrastructure services and clearly will need to afford visibility to the development or benefit related to the monetization of the asset. And so in this way, there are actors in some countries that haven't yet taken the step, like pension funds. We know there are experiences in a number of countries of their involvement, but often there's talk about triggering investment by these actors, but there is often not the profile and asset profile that makes it attractive to investors. And here the example is for roads, but the recycling model could be applied to any kind of infrastructure as long as including the cash flow generation conditions that can make this attractive to the private sector. How do we apply the model? And here I will focus on some basic ideas that I think are worth recalling. And we focus on this because when discussing the asset recycling model, some tend to think of securitization. And here I will start discussing each of these. In the case of securitization, what you do is take flows from public administration, whether central government or another agency, and what you do is to use the particular cash flows, and what you do there is assume the repayment risk with regard to the institution whose resources are being used. When we talk about asset recycling, it's different because you will monetize an asset, but you will transfer to the private sector the risks and responsibilities inherent in it. So under that approach, the state, the government will own the project for good. And this is not a privatization, far from it. We have the concessionaire, that would be the companies participating as experts managing the infrastructure. Then we have the banks or the financiers who will enter the recycled project. We have the component of liabilities, and then we have the fiduciaries that are part of the financing structure. And all of these basic elements I highlight because that gives us an idea of the value of the infrastructure asset. And we are talking about the market value of an infrastructure asset. We are not talking about the value as such of the project, of the works, rather the value of the project in terms of business and of the cash flows that could be generated, and what part of that could be recycled or optimized. So within the components we mentioned at the outset, we should 2 more minutes to wrap up, and then we move on to the questions, okay? Yes, we're on the mark. So we have an asset that will be monetized, and we must ask what would be the investments the asset would require, if it required some kind of enhancement or expansion. Then we have the cash flow generation, the allocations as appropriate, and that will help us estimate the recyclable amount of the project. How much could we extract for the purpose of having new investments? I think this is one thing we discussed in the previous panel as well. What is important here is for this to be done facing the market. So this asset monetization should go hand in hand with the reality of the market, so that once the project is out there, it will arouse interest on the part of concessionaires and financiers. Finally, here we talk about building in a model that will offer two things. In addition to gaining new resources for new investments, it will allow us to get into an infrastructure assets scheme for management, away from this idea of building and forgetting, having much more active institutional stakeholders, including pension fund managers, insurers, and others who could help capitalize the savings that would be channeled to other projects. Finally, what would be the challenges for us in Latin America in order to implement this model? Clearly, we have a funding issue that has to do with the culture as regards payment for infrastructure services, and this is an important thing that must change over time due to the changes we'll see in these key income sources. We need a long-term vision. No model will work unless we look at the long term, independently of any election processes. And asset recycling, by the way, makes sense if we change the mindset that focuses on isolated individual projects and really moves towards asset management approaches. We need clear rules and institutional capacity as well. We wouldn't be able to do much if we were to launch a model such as this one without having the institutional capacities that allow us to go out to the market with seriousness, responsibility, making it attractive, and creating trust in citizens. Latin America has a chance of applying this interesting model of asset recycling, but implementation will require a change of mindset and paradigm away from carrying out isolated projects and moving on to decided, vigorous, ongoing and sustained development of projects with fiscal sustainability and good service quality and delivery. Thank you very much, Federico, for that presentation. I would just like to ask you a couple of questions. I agree with you that this is an opportunity to be explored, and we should see how this fits into the current status of institutional development. How do you see it? Do you think it's a concrete possibility in some countries? Have you had a chance to look at any particular countries? What would be your first reactions? Well, like any other PPP, I think the institutional factor is key. I would start by saying that the first challenge we have, at least in the case of countries that could apply this, the first challenge you may face is that when you present the asset recycling or monetization model, some actors, especially those further away from infrastructure, think this is the vehicle to be able to serve public debt, or to pay public debt service, or they see a window of opportunity here that that's not what it's about. It's not about how to get resources from infrastructure to pay for public debt, but rather the goal is to have much more efficient infrastructure and management of infrastructure. Some countries have specificities that make it perhaps possible for them to apply this model. Costa Rica has adopted a legal amendment to allow asset recycling in 2019. Countries like Paraguay could also have space to create and develop asset recycling. At one point, we were also able to look at the case in Panama, which has developed very significant infrastructure, but it still faces the challenge of proper maintenance and management for the road uh, infrastructure, which has grown a lot in recent years. So that's a challenge for them. How do we manage that infrastructure? I think there are several countries that could look at this, but the first step is to ensure that decision makers understand the ultimate goal of this model. It is a model for the management and delivery of infrastructure services in an effective manner. And it's not to be seen as a vehicle to get fresh funds to reduce public debt. Thank you very much, Federico. Also, I think the institutional structure of countries will vary. I think of Australia. I think there was an initiative by the Federal Treasury with a strong bias towards efficiency enhancement by means of programs that were then applied at the state level. For federal countries, this may be a bit of a fiscal carrot so as to promote some efficiency and financial sustainability in the infrastructure sector. Although in your next to last slide, you mentioned that several sectors could look at this, it would appear that the obvious choice would be transport. Ports, airports in the region are already mainly run privately. Do you see any kind of infrastructure asset that could be a natural candidate, so to speak? And I would also like to ask you, what do you think would be the kinds of institutional or regulatory reforms that we would need to pave the way for asset recycling initiatives? Good questions, Gaston. I agree that the primary sector for this is transport, but it is also true that governments have assets that probably, due to the way they operate or perceive things, may not be fully taken advantage of. At one point, there was talk about applying the model to the health care sector. And we're not talking about projects related to hospitals that may require payment for availability, but related services, let's say, such as all the clinical services, parking services attached to the health facilities. That's one thing that could be applied. And also sanitation, the treatment of sewage and also water distribution, because after all, we have seen cases of countries facing major losses in that regard. And these are very sensitive sectors. Clearly, I talked about health and water, which are highly sensitive. So there is room for applying this to other sectors, but I think the first steps will almost necessarily be in the transport sector, so as to put the model to the test and learn some lessons before this is used in other sectors with different sorts of sensitivities. Now, as regards some key reforms, here we go from the very easy to the most complex in public policy. The thing is, tariff models, which can be a challenge. It's happened in some countries already. In Costa Rica, the reform took place because the old tariff models didn't allow the inclusion of the payment by the concessionaires in the arrangement. So the payment by the concessionaire would not be regarded as an investment as such. So one first step would be the possibility of including that within the tariff structure of countries. Another point which I don't know whether it would require a legal reform, or perhaps it's more related to the adoption of good practices. It's mapping the value of the assets you have as government or administration, so as to be able to identify the assets that you could apply the asset recycling model to. Finally, I'm not sure that it's the most complicated of all reforms, but how could we afford certainty to go beyond individual election cycles? It's not that things will be sorted out within a single term or political cycle. The key point, I would say, primarily is the tariff structure and how can you include the component of asset recycling to begin with. Thank you very much, Federico. The question that remains, I suppose, is assuming we have mapped the assets and assuming that we have the institutional and regulatory conditions that are needed in place, what vehicle do you think generates that comfort in being able to ensure that the funds will be used to maintain infrastructure? There's probably intermediate options, I suppose, to ensure long-term sustainability or fiscal sustainability, and perhaps one may change the shares within the vehicle. Fonadin is a good regional example of a fund, although it wasn't originally planned that way. It's kind of a second derivation. The idea of creating a fund. This was funded through the nationalization of funds that had to do with the nationalization of roads in Mexico. I think it now manages 50 roads and one or two bridges. And what they're doing is basically charging tolls, and that way they enter into new transactions. So the Fonadin is somehow working as a fund that has an earmark for this purpose. Yes, and that is the other very important point for this to make sense. If we have an asset recycling model in which resources simply fly away and vanish, I think that undermines the confidence in the model totally. There are two pathways here to apply this. I think I would be careful of one of them, which would be the idea that the concessionaire who will do the recycling is the one in charge of the development of the projects that will be triggered through the funds. And I say that I would be a bit more wary of this because a whole lot of issues come into the picture. The profits that the concessionaire may generate by developing the projects, then this issue of the alignment of services, and then the other point that would perhaps offer more comfort to the users and to the government in the region is some special purpose vehicle or some fund, trust fund perhaps, for the recycled funds to get into, so that from there you can actually contract for the development of the resources. In Costa Rica, with the reform, this was one of the provisions included in the law, one of the mandates, due to the fear that if this were to go into the single fund or cash of desk of the state, the funds would be lost. But if you have a specific vehicle or fund, the resources can go in there and they can be used for the preparation and execution of the projects. There would be an additional layer there because those projects could even be recycled again, considering the revolving nature of infrastructure, which is what we aim at in this kind of model. I think those are key things, trying to earmark the resources and then ensuring that that we avoid the mistakes of the past. And as far as possible, we should try and ensure that part of the executed projects can come back to the recycling cycle in order to afford long-term sustainability to the model. And finally, one last question. I think the key point here has to do with whether we are moving towards a model like the one you suggested when you talked about the fuel tax and about the way we have been financing or not infrastructure. Because often we've seen situations where revenue that was going to go into infrastructure was captured and used for other purposes in the context of fiscal crisis. Considering the longer term and the paradigm change and the use of new energy sources and fuels for vehicles, we can't stay focused on the old financing model. So we would be moving towards a model of payment for use, as you said. And how do you view that transition happening? I think at the same time, that will raise issues of social sensitivity. We have a population that has suffered a lot with low purchasing power, payment capabilities low in a region, in addition to the habit of not being used to paying for infrastructure and having access to infrastructure without considering the associated cost, because that idea that services are free of charge is false. That's a very good point. Above all things, the transition will take time. We can't change overnight, but the interesting thing is that as you execute and adopt recycling models, often things will happen by themselves with new technology, but we may have to make up for this with some kind of partial compensation. Of course, the taxes or contributions going forward, when looking at the revenue funds, the way we've set up these funds in the case of telecommunications, for example, the funds could perhaps start to fund the roads. In other words, the government should have an all-encompassing view of its network of roads, say, and in this way have cross subsidies so that regions with higher purchasing power or with higher traffic levels or more economic activity can help those that are still lagging a bit and need support in order to create projects and payment conditions that reflect the payment capabilities of the individual regions. I think that's the way we will gradually move. Yes, the universal service funds, basically, right? Which made it possible for people to have household telephone lines and, of course, then reality caught up. Thank you very much for that introduction. I think it's definitely worth looking at, and we need to see what conclusions we can extrapolate to our region. Thank you very much.